So let's say if we took an all-white sitcom or an all-white person show, could we change that and put an Indian character as the main person in the show? And would people still watch that? And the answer should be yes, because it shouldn't matter who is portraying the character, because it's someone that we should be able to relate to.
請勿靠近車門，請不要靠近車門。Please stand back from the doors.
Hello, and welcome back to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. This is a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. We interview guests of various Asian backgrounds, mostly from the diaspora. We look to highlight, amplify, and validate their voices. I'm your host. My name is Kyle, and today we have a special guest. This special guest is someone I was introduced to from our previous guest, Suraj from Brown People We Know podcast. Very good podcast. Check him out, and also check out the episode that I've done with him. And before I get to this individual, I just want to let everyone know, if you want to support this podcast, please just keep listening, subscribe to the podcast, and also follow the podcast on Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. Your support is greatly appreciated, and we hope to just keep delivering great Asian stories to you. And hopefully you'll feel inclined to keep listening and also share it with those that you think would benefit from it or just gain value from it. And without further ado, I wanted to just introduce my guest, Malaika. Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Very happy to have you on the podcast because I heard great things about you from Suraj. But before we start with all those things, I just want to know a little more about your life and your story. So can you just let the audience know like who you are, what you're about, and most importantly, what kind of Asian are you?
Yeah, so I'm a South Asian Indian, and both of my parents were immigrants to the United States. And yeah, I'm a senior at American University in Washington, D.C., and I'm studying journalism and I'm minoring in political science. So that's just a little bit about me and what kind of Asian I am.
Can you just talk about like where in America that you kind of grow up in and like what kind of things you have done when you were younger and all that?
Yeah, so I grew up in northern New Jersey in a small town called Basking Ridge. I guess it's small for New Jersey. Maybe it's not so small for other states, but yeah, it had a large Indian and South Asian immigrant population, and it just kept growing with my generation. So for my parents, they had a really good kind of stable like Indian friend group, and it's growing still. I just went back home and they had we have a Basking Ridge Indian community, and in that community they hold these events. So the amount of Indian immigrants in my city in New Jersey just keeps growing, which is awesome. But within that, I was really able to be connected to my roots and my culture. So at a young age, my parents put me in Indian classical dance and Indian classical music. So my parents' lineage is from South India. And so if anyone who knows India and Indian culture, it's a large diaspora of cultures and ethnicities within India itself. So within that, my parents are South Indian, and so they always try to instill that culture into me, which I very much appreciate because it really helped me kind of find what I'm passionate about. And so I did Indian classical dance, which is called Bharatanatyam, and I learned that for about 14 years. And then I also did Indian classical music, and I learned that for about 10 years. So it was something that was really instilled inside of me for a very long time and from a very young age, which I'm really grateful for, because I think if it had been instilled in me a little bit later in my life, I think it wouldn't have made as great of an impact as it did from kind of learning it from the age of, 3, 4, 5 years old.
That's amazing. And I always hear those that are my peers that are of South Asian descent and all that stuff in terms of what their parents kind of put them through in terms of like classes or whatnot. It's always like, oh yeah, Indian dance or Indian music, which I find really interesting as in terms of like normally, at least from my experience, my background with East Asian, a lot of it is based on like, oh, language learning, retaining the language. But it seems like for South Asians, there's a lot more like talk is regarding like Indian music and Indian dance. But I'm sure that's not to say that South Asian parents didn't care about the language, because I know a lot that does speak it to a varying degree. But would you say that they did put more emphasis on like the dance and music aspect? Because it seems like we don't really hear about like, oh, South Asian go into language schools, just like how East Asians have done.
I think it's a more like rounded experience. We don't really have like language schools per se, but we have cultural schools. So there's, for South Indians, there's a cultural school called Chinmaya Mission, which is big in New Jersey and Texas and California, the large three states with a large South Asian population. And those they do teach languages there, but it's very much also about music and dance, and those are two very integral parts of Indian culture. And South Asian culture as a whole, but specifically Indian culture. And I think because of the way South Asian culture is kind of revolved around these three things of language, music, and dance, it just became easier to make it like a cultural rounded school instead of just a language school, especially because there are so many different languages in India that it is very difficult to make one language school for one language. A lot of people will say, oh, the primary language is Hindi, but that's not necessarily true. It's just in North India that the primary language is Hindi. So I feel like making a language school in the US would be very difficult, especially at the age where I was growing up, when that was really when it was a big boom of Indian immigrants. Before then, it really wasn't that many Indian immigrants that were living in the United States, at least near me in New Jersey. But in the late 1990s is really when a lot of people around my parents' age generation decided to kind of immigrate to the US and stay here and make a life here for themselves. I honestly don't really know much about like the reasoning behind it. I can really only speak from what I've noticed personally. But I think it really started to grow in the 1960s is really when a lot of, Indian and South Asian immigrants decided to start immigrating to the US. But I know with, some of my mom's friends who have older children, they didn't really have as much of an Indian community at high school or in middle school that I did, because it was really in the late 1990s when a lot of more Indian first generation Americans were being born. But I think for my parents and maybe their friend circle or this generation of those parents, it was more opportunities that were available to them. I think the previous generation wasn't given those same opportunities, whether it be for political or government reasons. It could have been visas or just non-educational opportunities. But also at the time, the U.S. was seen as this great, unattainable, very difficult thing to get. A visa to come here, to be able to get into a school here was a big deal. And I think it kind of peaked in the 1990s and it's slowly depleted. A lot of my cousins, because my dad was the only one to come here from out of his 7 siblings, he was the only one to come to the US. And all of my other cousins on that side of my family live in India. And a lot of them have chosen to go to other places to study or have chosen to stay in India. They have chosen not to come to the US. And one of my cousins actually decided to go back. And so I think that it was really a peak when, my parents and their generation decided to come to the US, because right now India is booming, but there's also so many other countries that a lot of people are trying to immigrate to because they've just found those A, much easier to immigrate to, and B, just they think they'll be much happier there. One country that comes to mind is the Netherlands. And I know that they have, one of the most happiest, population indexes in the world. And so I think that with my parents at the time, the US was this bright light in trying to, you're smart and you can achieve it. And once you get there, you'll make this amount of money. And I'm very grateful because my parents, I've always kind of been very proud of them for this fact that they are self-made. Whatever they made off of their own hard work. And that's taught me a lot because, they're doing really well for themselves. And I'm very grateful for that. But I do think that in that time, the US was this safe haven. And I think while it still stands, obviously, as one of the superpowers of the world, that standing has faltered a little bit, I think, at least in the eyes of immigrants who are coming to the US, especially from countries like India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, a lot of the, East Asian and South Asian countries. I think that mindset of what the US is and what it can represent has changed. And I think a lot of it has to do with politics, but I also think a lot of it has to do just with like educational standards, and things have evolved over the past 30 years. But
Wow, that's a very in-depth, very thorough response. Really great to hear that. And talking about how your parents really thought, oh, America is that safe light or safe haven. Did now that they've been in like America for a lot of years now, they built a family here and all that stuff. Do they, or at least how you see them in terms of their mindset of what America is and the American dream and all that stuff, did it change or do they have a new perspective on it now, given all the situation that is happening?
Um, they definitely did. I think I remember when Trump was elected, my mom was so like deeply just upset the next day because I think when she came to the US, she was very, like newly coming to the US. She really did not know what to expect. But I know, India is often seen, the Indian government is often seen as, this very corrupt establishment. And it is. But at the time, I think because of the way the US was, having its massive trajectory, especially in government, at the time Bill Clinton was revered by all of the immigrants who were coming to the US, and obviously we know he's not a perfect person and nor was he a perfect president, but at the time my mom remembers looking up to the TV and just thinking, wow, like that is America, that's an American president, why don't we have that in India? And then when Trump was elected, my mom was just saying the country that she knew is just no longer the same thing, and doesn't hold the same values. And so that was just really interesting for me to kind of hear because she felt as if, the way, obviously, the rhetoric that, at the time the Republican Party was using and, Trump was using was so harmful to immigrants, and especially people who look like us. And so it's interesting to kind of see the rise and fall of what my parents have kind of noticed about the US. I remember when COVID first started last year, India was doing much better than we were doing at the time. And I remember asking my parents, "Do you think we would have been happier if you had decided to stay there? Do you think you would have had the same life? Do you think you would have had the same lifestyle?" And my parents were unsure of the answer. I think obviously, income is a different weighing factor. It's different. It's different economy. It's a different monetary amount. Rupees are different than dollars, so I think it's different. But I know whenever we do visit India, we are able to, afford things that some of my other family is not able to, or, I see other people are not able to around me. And that makes me very grateful for the fact that, my parents were able to come here. And like I said before, they worked super hard to, be able to get the standing that they are in today. But I think that feeling, kind of going back to your original question, is wavering. I think at some points they are very, happy with their decision. And I don't think that happiness has ever changed. But I think sometimes you do feel discontent in the place that you are, thinking, what if? And I know I've had that as well. And I've never made a large decision to move my life to another country. So I can't imagine what the weight of that decision feels like. But they've been here. My dad has been here for almost 30 years now, and my mom for about 25. And so every time we go somewhere else, this is home. And that it has been like that ever since I can remember. So I think that while the feelings of what if will always be there, they're also very content with the life that they've made.
That's great. And you mentioning how like, oh, the what ifs, you thought about it yourself as well. So like going back to yourself and your thoughts and feelings about this whole issue, like, oh, which place is better per se? Do you ever have a thought? Have you ever thought, oh, maybe it would have been nice if I was in India instead, or like that I was able to kind of live there rather than America because of the fact that, oh, I will be actually where everyone is similar to me, or that that cultural differences won't be as major, because I see in terms of this whole COVID situation, a lot of diaspora Asians that are like, oh, their parents are immigrants to United States. A lot of them are like, oh, maybe I should be back home in Asia because Asia had been dealing with COVID a lot better and all that stuff. And seeing how Asia is growing and growing compared to America, a lot of them are like, oh, America isn't that great anymore. Or like, oh, my motherland is better per se.
I don't think I would have been, the same person if I had grown up there. And that's not to say that I wouldn't love to, work there at some point, or live there for a certain amount of years. I would love to be able to live somewhere else besides the United States just to kind of see what that looks like and what that feels like. But I also think that I'm really lucky that I get the best of both worlds, where I am American, but I'm also Indian. Um, and I've been able to kind of balance or mesh both of the identities and cultures. Um, and it's very interesting that you say that I sound very secure in that, because it I have never thought that I am. It's a very interesting diaspora to grow up with and kind of um, try to navigate, especially when you're a teenager and when you're a kid, because obviously if you are different than a majority of the people at your school or in your town, you do feel kind of disconcerted and a minority and kind of sidelined. And that's a very difficult thing to navigate when you're 10 to 18 years old. And even now, I think I've only really become secure, like very comfortable with my Indian identity now. I remember like when I was growing up, I wouldn't want my mom to send Indian food in my lunchbox to school because obviously it was different and I didn't want that. And then in high school, I stopped taking food from home. I just would buy school lunches. And I, I don't know if I necessarily regret doing that, because I think I do to a certain extent. It definitely, when I first told it to my mom, I can't imagine what she thought in her head. But I also think that that taught me a lot, because now I'm an extra advocate for the fact that I never want anyone to feel like they should feel diminished or should feel sidelined because of their ethnicity or identity. And I think that that is very important. And that goes even beyond just being South Asian. I think nobody should feel like that, especially in a place that's called a global melting pot like the United States. And so um, I think that while, you know, growing up, I might not have felt that pride. That really changed for me when I became more secure in who I was and my identity as a whole. And kind of going back to your original question, I think I wouldn't have received that if I wasn't able to get that balance between two identities. And I feel really lucky that I was able to do that. Not everybody can say that they have that. So I'm trying to look at the bright side of things and kind of not think about that what if, but I also would love to live anywhere around the world, whether it be India or any other country. And unfortunately, I was going to study abroad, but I wasn't able to because of COVID. But yeah, I think that would be a really cool opportunity to be able to do that at some point in my life.
That's great. And I like how you talked about, oh, yeah, I did have a period where I was insecure, where I was not liking the fact that I'm bringing Indian food to school because people could potentially make fun of it, even though like you probably loved your mom's food and all that stuff. And it's really funny to me of how things are now, because looking back, like yeah, way back when I was in school, like maybe primary or even like high school times, yeah, people look at Asian food and be like, oh, what is that? Or like, oh, you're eating that. But now it's like I would have like encounters where it's like maybe a white person, I'd be like, oh, have you tried this Indian food spot or like any Asian spot? It's like it's nice that they're getting around to liking it, but a slight feeling of like you were probably the type of people that were like, what are you eating? And like, why are you eating this? That kind of thing. So what you said really I think holds true for a lot of diaspora Asians with immigrant parents and all that stuff. And talking more about like just your experience growing up, uh, one thing I want to really talk to you about, because it seems like with all your projects that you are a part of, a main kind of focus or element is the whole aspect of media representation in terms of like South Asians, especially with Brown People We Know podcast and also the other projects that you do. What does media representation mean to you?
I think media representation is something that should just be encompassing. Like it should just be a part of media as a whole. Um, I think what representation that any person of color is asking for is just to see someone who looks like them without being stereotyped. And I think when it comes to specifically South Asian media representation, the conversation should be about how can we showcase people who are not stereotyped as South Asians, and that thought process, the stereotypical engineer doctor with an Indian accent, and a much broader question of, okay, so let's say if we took an all-white sitcom or an all-white person show, could we change that and put an Indian character as the main person in the show? And would people still watch that? And the answer should be yes, because it shouldn't matter who is portraying the character, because it's someone that we should be able to relate to. And I think that a show that does this really well is Never Have I Ever. And I know that its newest season just came out and it's getting like all of these reviews off of Netflix. But and don't get me wrong, I think that the show is amazing, and especially with its representation. And so while on the same side, Davy's character can sometimes be, a little bit annoying. We sometimes don't really love her. But I think that her tweet, my 30s tweet, that she put out, the tweet about the fact that Davy doesn't represent all Indian girls. And I think that that is something that is really powerful as well, because kind of referencing what I was saying before is, although we are getting that representation, we are getting the South Asian representation that we're looking for, and the show is amazing, Devi and her character don't represent all Indian girls. And I can speak from personal experience. Like I don't feel a super big connection to Devi. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that that representation is amazing and super heartwarming to see, and very important for young Indian girls to see growing up, because we didn't have that. My generation didn't have that. And so going back to your original question about media representation, I think media representation's job is to make sure that everyone feels included, and not only inclusivity, but everyone feels represented, because that is something that I think we're slowly touching upon, not only in the media, but in every sense, whether it be in clothing, whether it be in like anything that you're seeing, like representation and diversity matters and inclusivity matters. And I think that that is a whole part of media, and media is everywhere. That's something that I really learned in my one of my base communication classes. One of my foundation communication classes was, what is media? And we think it's this one answer. It's, the computer, television, Spotify. It's all of these things, but media is really just any form of communication. And so I think representation in any form of communication is beneficial and vital to making sure that everyone feels included.
Really nicely said, and I agree completely with what you're saying, and like a very great point on like we cannot represent everyone with just one character within the Indian diaspora, because India is huge, and
Yeah.
we can't like get to the point where we can get everyone represented if not even one type of person from that diaspora get represented. So I think it takes time, but I think we're just getting more and more impatient to see others rise up to like getting the representation that they've been working really hard towards. But it's in a sense taking away all the effort other groups have done. So I think we just have to be patient. We just working, develop good stories, tell the stories, and wait for it to harvest. And I was just wondering for yourself with media representation, especially when you're younger. You mentioned there wasn't that many in America or like Western mediascape. So how did you feel about that? And just that does that mean that you had to look elsewhere, maybe back in the Indian landscape to find that? Or were you like, oh, this is what it is, I'm okay, and that's fine, and just keep it moving kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the first kind of representation I saw on like mainstream television was Karan Brar on Jesse. I think that for me, like growing up, that was the show that I would watch, and I absolutely love that show. Great concept. I love that show. But I think for me at the time, I thought the actor actually had an Indian accent. So I thought that they they went to India, scouted an Indian boy around the same age, and then just kind of brought him over to Hollywood. And that wasn't the truth. And, at the time, I really, really loved his character, and I still do. I thought all the characters were really well written and really, well dispersed. But kind of hearing back what Karan himself has spoken about the character and kind of his misgivings about, doing the Indian accent, it was really interesting to kind of hear back on, because I think a lot of times, especially in my generation growing up in the late 2000s and early 2010s, it was an idea of, okay, representation is there, so what else do we need? But I think we also need to acknowledge that, yes, representation is really important, but we also need the non-stereotypical representation. And unless we provide that non-stereotypical representation, the representation is meaningless, in my opinion. I think, always seeing Indians in the roles of doctors, it shouldn't, that is not the case. There's so many Indians who go into so many other professions, and that should be, highlighted and exemplified. And kind of going back to Never Have I Ever, I really liked that idea, where, Devi is really smart at school, but that doesn't mean that, she's not good at other things. There's always that concept that, oh, if you're Asian, you're only good at school, you're not good at sports. And I really liked that, sorry, spoiler alert, if anyone is listening and hasn't watched the season 2, but like in one of the episodes, she does a great job in, she goes from failing PE to really showing she's athletic and great at sports. And I really liked that, you're kind of hitting at those biases and stereotypes and saying, no, that's not true. And I think that when we talk about representation in my age, we saw Jasmine as one of the Disney princesses, and that's really who, as a South Asian girl, you could identify with. But if you think about it, the way it was written, it was extremely westernized as a story. And that's sad to see, kind of looking back, because it could have been so much more authentic. But again, it's also a Disney movie. It's a Disney storybook. And so there's only so much kind of authentication you can ask for. But I think moving forward into the age that we are at, we are seeing a lot more South Asians in the field of film and television and portraying these roles that aren't stereotypical. And I think that kind of representation is meaningful and really important, because unless we kind of break those biases, we're never going to be able to move forward as an ethnicity group, and kind of break those molds that have been laid out for us, especially in Western cinema. But sorry, really quick, just to touch upon what you were saying in the question about like where I turned to, I definitely watched a lot of Indian movies just growing up with my parents. But I think along with that, I forgot to kind of remember that when I was looking at Disney Channel shows, and it was mainly, white female characters at the time, I kept forgetting that, oh, I don't look like them. So things that suit them, things that look good on them won't look good on me. And I remember like when I was watching Hannah Montana, I was like, oh, I want blonde hair. And, I want this, I want a pink rhinestone phone. And I wanted all of these things that matched those characters, but that didn't necessarily mean that it would fit me because it didn't represent me. And I think that that is really difficult to understand when you're a little kid growing up in a mainly westernized and mainly white society. And I think that that's changing with the times, obviously, with more and more immigrants coming to the US and more and more immigrant children being born. I think that that is really providing for a larger scope of representation in media.
I really like your story about watching Hannah Montana. Like I want to be like Hannah Montana, dress like her and all this stuff, and then you suddenly realize, it's not that I shouldn't be able to do what she does, but like it still doesn't fit as much as you think it is when you're envisioning it. And like with like all these kind of talks of like media representation, I'm just thinking like how critical it is, like you mentioned, like, oh, we are showing like non-stereotypical things, like where, oh, they don't need to just be really good at school, they could be good at other things, or they don't even need to be good at school, they could do other things as well. And I think we're slowly getting to that point, but then we still are facing the issue of like because there's so few representation that we're leaning toward. We all just have to show the best type of representation, regardless of what medium it is. So if it's something really bad, oh, maybe it's like a killer that's Asian on TV. Oh, we can't have that because we don't have enough of other representations to be like, oh, that's not all of us. So I think we are still having that hurdle, and I hope that we could like take away that kind of like mentality, because at the end of the day, it's still just media and art, and it's like it doesn't really reflect real life completely. And I think it'd be a while before we get to the point where it's like, oh, if we see that they're representing us in a way where the character is not great, it's the people that everybody hates that person, we should be fine with it. I don't think we're there yet, but we're slowly getting there, and hopefully we could get to that point. But I don't know what needs to be done in order to get to that point. It's just we have more of us in those representational role, or what? Because right now it seems like we're fixed on we're only showing the best of the best. If it's bad media content that's by Asians, we can't have that. And it shows we're like, oh, Crazy Rich Asians and other films that they don't fit stereotypically with like, oh, like highly regarded and stuff. But then we're like, oh, we shouldn't have that because it's still representing us in a bad way. Do you feel the same way?
Um, I mean, I don't think that we shouldn't have it at all. I think representation in any sense is good and in any form is good. It matters how, like, I keep going back to this word, how meaningful the representation is, because representation is there and is important. I think, even people who have guest roles who are providing representation in any form, whether it be in race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, I think any of that is important. But I also think, especially when it comes to, personally, from what I can speak of and from the experiences I can speak of when it comes to South Asian representation, I feel like you can have representation as long as it's not damaging with the stereotypes that it's like perceiving to the audience. And I think that when it comes to the largely, stereotypical films or TV shows that are based off of a minority's stereotypes that are made, that can draw a lot of criticism. I know when Priyanka Chopra did her show Quantico, it drew a lot of criticism because they were showing a South Asian be portrayed as a terrorist. And obviously, she's a superstar, not only in Hollywood, but, she really started off in Bollywood. So she's a superstar in India and all over the world. And the show was well written for the first couple of seasons. And it was good representation to have because she was the first, South Asian superstar to come from the Indian film industry to the United States. And that was amazing. That really paved the way not only for her, but any other film superstar from that film industry to come to the US. So that representation is meaningful. But at the same time, the stereotype that her character portrayed on television, that can be harmful to societies that aren't fully mindful of the fact that that is a stereotype that was negatively portraying her character. And I think that that can be really harmful when people aren't fully aware of the fact that, okay, we can't label, all South Asian people as terrorists because of, this stereotype that is against them. And that can be really difficult to try and combat in conversation if that is the representation that is being put out there to people who aren't aware of the diaspora of the South Asian society. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did, and you raised a lot of good points. And yeah, I just hope like, oh, we can look past like having characters full of stereotype. We can do better. That we are creative enough that we can't always have to rely on stereotypes. Like obviously there are stereotypes where it could be positive, or it's just you don't mention it at all. You don't need stereotypes to create good content and good storytelling. And moving away from like stereotypes and stuff to better like good representation, how do you see what's happening right now, and what do you see in the future? Because right now it seems like the Never Have I Evers and all these kind of small or like indie or even mainstream productions that are more mindful of how media representation towards especially Asian or South Asian are being done, as in like, oh, getting the right staff behind the camera to kind of lead it and all that stuff. So how do you see it being like a person that seems to be very knowledgeable in like media representation, also given what you're studying and such?
Yeah, I think that expands into, a bigger point in the sense of representation can't just be on camera, it has to be off camera too. And that means writer's room. I think it also means directors, producers, stylists. I was just talking about this actually with some of my colleagues, but we were talking about, keep going back to Never Have I Ever, but in addition to that show, there's a character who plays Baby's cousin's, arranged marriage fiance. And I forget the actor's name, but he was also on Grey's Anatomy. And it's interesting because you can see in the first season that the makeup doesn't match his skin tone. So he shows up super orange in the first season of Never Have I Ever. And I think there could have been a multitude of reasons for that, but I think a large part that goes behind that is maybe the stylist doesn't know how to work with people of color and their like skin color palettes, because especially when you are South Asian, not every foundation matches. I can speak from my own experience of prom. Like I went to a large makeup store that does makeup. And I didn't think about this at the time because again, I was willfully unaware that there are these minute differences between people who are not people of color and people who are. And my makeup artist who did my makeup was white, and she chose a foundation that was not my skin color. And I'm very non-confrontational, much more so non-confrontational at the time, but I'm still not as confrontational as I would like to be. And I didn't say anything because I was like, okay, she's the makeup artist, she knows. And she was like, oh, it'll oxidize with your skin. And that was not the case. I was very orange on that day of prom. And I kind of think back, and I think if I had had someone who was South Asian, they would have understood my skin tone better, because obviously you have, underlying, I forget what they're called. I think they're like skin color palettes or something, like underneath. Like a lot of people will say you have orange underneath your eyes or something. So you have to use a color corrector to kind of match that. And I think that, different makeup palettes can only account for so much, especially if they aren't made to be diverse and inclusive. And I hope that that makes sense. So like, I think that a lot of makeup brands now are becoming more inclusive, not only with the shades of foundation that they're making, but, contour colors, blush colors, not, the traditional blush colors that work with, white palettes or white skin does not work on every skin color. Because, on my skin, it can show up super pink and that just looks weird. And so I think that that kind of representation behind the camera is as important as on camera. Because those things are really apparent to people who are of that ethnicity or of that race. I think it becomes so much more apparent that, oh, they made a mistake here, or this isn't the right, tone for their skin color. I think that it can be a wrong form of representation if you're making those mistakes, but you're attempting to kind of break those stereotypes at the same time. It can seem almost a little bit ironic. And don't get me wrong, like I said before, I love the show. And I think that having Mindy Kaling as the backing of that show is amazing. Especially, coming off of being the sole South Asian writer for The Office. I think it's awesome. But at the same time, I think that having that same representation off camera for every show that is representing South Asians is really important.
For sure. And a lot of our conversation has been about like media representation and how South Asians are the South Asian experience. And you've been talking about those very eloquently. And I think part of it will have to come from this your studies, your area of expertise. Can you just let the audience know, like more specifically, your experience in studying journalism and also political science, and like why did you get into those fields?
Yeah. So I started off being not a political science major. So American University has this major called CLEG, which is unique to the university, and it's housed in the School of Public Affairs, but it's basically communication, legal studies, economics, and government, all in one major. And as you can tell, it's basically 4 minors in one major. And so I realized very quickly that this wasn't something that I wanted to do. So I changed it to political science because I'd always done public speaking. I did congressional debate growing up. And so I really thought, okay, I want to do something in politics. I want to do something in the government. That's, really where I want to kind of sink my teeth into. And I did political science, and I realized that I have always been someone who values communications and media. And I've always been someone who really enjoys just kind of watching interviews. I love kind of seeing how that works. I've always listened to podcasts. I've always really liked immersing myself in books and TV shows and movies, and kind of the idea of communications as a whole, because books are also a form of media, which I don't think a lot of people realize sometimes. And I didn't realize that until I started taking my communications classes and realizing that everything around us is a form of media. Um, and I decided that I wanted to kind of switch to journalism. So I thought about maybe doing a journalism studies, minor along with my political science major, and that wasn't offered at my school. So I just completely switched full to journalism and did a minor in political science instead. And I've taken some, advanced journalism classes now at this point, and I'm going to be taking some advanced reporting classes this upcoming semester. And it's something that I'm really glad I did because I'm getting a large foundation in communications as a whole. I'm interning this summer, not at a news outlet, but at a design agency. And as a writer now for this design agency as an intern, it's so helpful for me to have a journalism background because it gives you a solid foundation in all things communications. And I'm really, really grateful for that. And I think that that has been really helpful for me to kind of analyze media and just communications as a whole. Um, and the intricacies that are part of it, just in general, I think has been something that has been really eye opening for me through my degree. And so I'm really glad that I've decided to do journalism, and we'll see what it takes for me in the future and where it takes me in the future. But for right now, I'm really glad that that's kind of the path that I decided to go on.
That's great. And yeah, I really think a lot more Asians in general should consider, journalism or just writing as a whole as a potential career rather than, if they want to be represented, we only could just go for acting or like be in front of the screen, that sort of stuff. Because I think there's so much work to be done on the journalism aspect, reporting news about your community and what you care about. That also very meaningful too. And with all that being said, is that how kind of led you to being part of Brown People We Know podcast, working with Suraj and helping him with the podcast, and how he's been doing great things with the podcast and stuff? Can you just talk about that experience?
Yeah, so I applied because there was a form in my cousin's Facebook group. I don't remember what the Facebook group was actually, but it was a Google form asking for a social media intern for Brown People We Know. And I was applying for internships for my spring semester this past year. So for Jan 2021, and my cousin sent it to me because we both run a podcast together. So she was like, why don't you try this? You've done social media internships before. That's really where I was kind of focusing my job experience for, the past fall semester. And so I was like, okay, yeah. So I applied for the position, and then Suraj got in touch with me, and he was like, well, I've already kind of filled this social media position for right now, but I would love for you to kind of do guest recruiting for me. So I kind of came onto the podcast in that form. And since then, I have kind of morphed into doing things production related. So whether it be social media, whether it be creating posts or finding statistics or guest recruiting. I do still do that as well. And I kind of reach out to some guests for the show. But I kind of function in all forms for production and try to make sure that I can help Suraj out in any way possible, because he is kind of like a one-man show and he's doing such a good job at being a one-man show. And I think that with the way the podcast has been reaching out to people in the past few months, it has amazing outreach. And so with that, we've been able to add a few other segments to the show with that amount of outreach and kind of support and listen. So that has been really fun and really great. And it's a really good learning experience for me to learn about how podcast is produced and how to kind of grow a social media page and kind of take different ideas and input them all at once and record and edit and all of these multitude of things that go into running a podcast, because mine is so very niche and still small. And so we're still trying to figure out how to get it to grow and operate it. And so it's been a really good learning experience for me to be a part of his podcast. And I'm really, really proud of that.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, Brown People Who Know is a great podcast. People should definitely check it out. And you mentioned kind of briefly, I think you didn't really want to talk too much about it, but I want to really know about your little podcast that you say you have. Can you just talk about the podcast that you do? You say it's niche, but I would like to know what it's about, and yeah, talk about that.
Yeah. So me and my cousin and I, so we basically run a podcast called the Sheroes Project. And it's a podcast where we interview women in STEM. So we have had about 2 seasons now. And we basically interview women who are part of the sciences, tech, engineering, and math. And we really try to put forward that representation for women in STEM because we feel like there really isn't a community around that. And I know a lot of people like sometimes wonder, like my friends and family will be like, why are you doing it? Because you are not in STEM. And so at the time, my cousin took over the show from her sister, who was the founder of the Sheroes Project. And we kind of transformed it into a podcast. So it's a video interview we post on YouTube as well, but we also put it on Spotify. And she'd asked me to kind of help with communications and outreach and social media. And I'm also just a co-host of the show. And it's been really helpful for me to learn more about, representation in STEM, especially as women. And not only that, it's helpful to learn as women in any corporate position in America. I think that a lot of times we think that, okay, women in STEM are the only ones who face gender discrimination, but that's not true at all. I recently just been reading Michelle Obama's new book, Becoming. And well, it's not new anymore, but it's new to me. And I've been reading about it, and she talks a lot about her time as a lawyer and kind of thinking back into that as not only a woman, but an African American woman is so astounding to me, the gender discrimination that she faced in these high powered law firms. And I think that we always think that women in STEM are the only ones who face gender discrimination. And while they do, I think any of the lessons I've heard from the women we've interviewed can be applicable to any woman who is, aiming to get the promotion over a man in the workforce, or trying to, fix the gender pay disparity, because that is a thing. And to just kind of move forward in the workforce, I think learning from them has been so beneficial for me.
People should definitely check it out. And it seems like you're about to finish your university career. You're gonna head into the real world, heading into a workplace, that kind of thing. What's kind of in your mind in terms of where you want to go with that? And yeah, where do you see yourself after graduation?
I honestly don't really know. And I'm sorry if that's not an answer, but I don't really know what I want to do. I'm getting so many different opportunities for, experience in fields that I'm interested in, that I really like doing all of them. And so I'm super unsure of where I want to kind of land my feet on. But I think in any form, I really just want to be like challenged in the work that I do. I feel really bored if I'm not doing something in the workday or not challenged enough. And I never thought I would say that as a kid who just didn't want to do homework, but I really kind of want to have that really good work-life balance too at the same time. Like I'd like to be challenged, but really only for, the 8.5 hours of the day. And I think that for me, I would really like anything to do with communications and anything to do with just meeting new and interesting people. And yeah, I really don't know kind of where I want that path to lead. I'm just kind of seeing where it goes and kind of taking it day by day, especially because the pandemic has changed a lot in terms of job opportunities that are available to people who are in media, especially for reporters. And so that has made me kind of shift my goal of, do I really want to work in a news media outlet? Is that something that I really want to do? And those are kind of the questions that I'm asking myself right now. So at this point in time, I don't really know for sure. I'm just kind of hoping that I can apply to a multitude of jobs and hopefully one sticks. But yeah, I don't really know exactly what I want to do yet. I'm just kind of hopeful that life shows me what I want to do.
Yeah, and I'm sure whatever you land on and decide to do, you'll be able to do it very well. And it's been such a great conversation. I learned a lot from you. Really, really feel inspired from what things you have said, and also what you're trying to do. And if people want to know more about you or just find the stuff that you do, your projects, can you just plug it now and let them know where they can find you?
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at just Malaika Ravindran. It's just my full name. And again, if like you need to get in contact with me for my email, it's just malaikaravindran@gmail.com. And you can just look me up, and my portfolio is on the internet. So if you need to see any of the articles or photography I've done, things like that, that's all available on there as well.
On that note, thank you so much for this talk and wish you all the best in everything that you do. And yeah, and for the listeners, if you want to keep supporting this podcast, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, follow the podcast on Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. And so the next episode, thank you for listening. Bye bye.